Welcome back from our break. So let's talk about state agencies, and we'll be using Texas as an example. This applies to most states and how they operate because every state has a Department of Environmental Quality. And one of the reasons I wanted to select Texas is because it's not called a Department of Environmental Quality, it's called a Commission on Environmental Quality. The reason actually goes back to the basis of where all of the rules came from for the original agency that made up what is now called TCEQ, Texas Commission on Environmental Quality. It dates back to when it was the Texas Water Commission. And this is an example of how a state legislature can change state agencies, combine and separate agencies, which is certainly what happened in the case of the Texas Water Commission, where it joined forces with the Air Control Board. And then ultimately, some of the responsibilities for landfills were given to the new agency where those two merged, the Texas Natural Resource Conservation Commission, and lead and asbestos were given to the Department of Health. So, long story made short, basically, when the legislature was asked to see if we could change our name to the Department of Environmental Quality, meaning the Texas agency, it would have cost millions of dollars to make that change. So the decision was made and approved to keep Texas unique as opposed to all the other states. So we are not a DEQ, we're a Commission on Environmental Quality. Suppose say you go to Maine and you need to report an environmental violation, it would probably be Maine's Department of Environmental Quality. Or if you were in Alaska or California, so forth. But Texas is unique. So our agency here in Texas is called the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, TCEQ, and it is the state equivalent of the Environmental Protection Agency. It is not deemed or given power by Congress, it's given power by a state legislature. So what has to happen is the state legislature is required to fulfill and mimic after the federal rules. So if the federal government passes environmental rules, the state needs to do the same. And that's exactly what's happened here. So TCEQ regulates the same stuff that EPA does, clean air, clean water, and protection of the land from hazardous industrial waste, as well as any kind of problematic land disposal. So one of their tools is that the Texas legislature deemed them the enforcement agency to carry out these missions. So TCEQ had to write rules, just like EPA did, for these particular items. Air quality, water conservation, water quality, safe disposal and management of waste, responding to environmental spills and emergencies, and of course, fighting against and enforcing against environmental crimes. So let's talk about air quality first, because air quality is important to Texas for this reason. Like many states, it has areas that do not meet the National Ambient Air Quality Standards. These are the outdoor air emission standards for things like ozone, particulate matter, and if Texas is busting those limits at the federal level, we certainly have a state set of laws that matches those national standards, and they can be as stringent or more stringent than the federal standards, but they can never be less stringent than the federal standards. So with that in mind, all the areas you see in blue over here in Texas, baby blue, are areas that are either near non-attainment or non-attainment. So let's define what attainment is first. Attainment means that you're meeting those federal air quality standards, the ambient air quality standards, ambient meaning outdoors. But if you are non-attainment, that would mean that you are not meeting those federal air quality standards. Subsequently, you would not be meeting the state of Texas rules either. When that happens, Congress made EPA put some kind of stipulation in their rules for the Clean Air Act that any entity or state that does not meet these standards must put action in place to correct that. So they have to develop what are called state implementation plans, SIPs. That would be a great bonus question. And so areas that have them in Texas would be like Houston, Dallas, Fort Worth, El Paso. These are areas that are non compliant in even San Antonio. So these are areas that are not attaining. Areas that are near non-attainment, for example, Corpus Christi, those types of areas, they require, and even Tyler, require that they start putting plans in place, but don't have to have a formal state implementation plan. They have to start getting education and things done to try to reduce those numbers so they don't find themselves flunking the rules. So air quality is a big deal because we all breathe and share the same air. Now, an example of an air permit might be this one right here. This is at Fort Hood, and you might think, oh, well, they're exempt from air quality standards or rules in general because they're a military operation or base. Not the case unless there's an imminent threat to human health and endangerment to our safety for national security purposes. So let's say overnight that we declare war and all the tanks and cars that they use need to be painted new colors, then that would be an exception to the rule. But on their day-to-day operations, and when we're not in an imminent threat of wartime for national security, they have to meet rules just like everyone else. The same is true for state agencies, like the Department of Transportation. An air permit at the state level is actually required for any business or entity that emits more than 25 tons of criteria air pollutants. And basically, there's a list that makes up criteria air pollutants. You would recognize some of these gases as volatile organic compounds known as VOCs, NOx gases, sulfur dioxide, which is SO2, lead, particulate matter. These are examples of criteria air pollutants. Interestingly enough, the one that is not is carbon dioxide. Whole nother discussion for climate change, why that one's not regulated currently. However, carbon monoxide is considered a criteria air pollutant. So if a facility issues or emits less than 25 tons of criteria air pollutants in a given year, they may qualify what's called as a permit by rule, PBR. And if they can, they want to, because permitting is expensive. You have to pay to get public notice, which can be thousands of dollars. You have to get engineering specs, and it can take several years to get permitted, where a permit by rule can be very, very quick. Another aspect of air quality that TCEQ regulates is outdoor burning. So when you look at outdoor burning, you'll notice that, for example, there's this mobile home being burned right here. This is an illegal burn. And so if an illegal burn occurs, then TCEQ could be notified by a citizen, or they could find out themselves and prohibit that, because this could be dangerous if it caught fire to these trees back here, not to mention that they're burning things that emit things like criteria air pollutants and maybe even hazardous air pollutants to the people nearby. So TCEQ is also charged with providing regulatory oversight and enforcement of water programs. And I'm going to highlight which water program we're talking about. There's multiple water programs that TCEQ regulates, but we'll start with surface water quality. When it comes to surface water quality, TCEQ's job is to protect the surface water in the state of Texas. Surface water is defined as everything that's not groundwater. And Texas actually excludes groundwater from the state of Texas definitions of waters of the state of Texas. So this could be rivers, lakes, pond, and it does not count rainwater that's diffused. So in other words, stormwater that's diffused. However, surface water quality does include this material right here. So this sampler right here is testing water quality for different constituents that you will learn about in Environmental Science 1302. And they're going to be looking for health of that river stream and applying it to standards. So if they bust the standards, then they must deal with something called the Clean Rivers Program and ultimately do a total maximum daily load, which is the same thing as a SIP, or state implementation plan for air quality. Water rights is one of the biggies in Texas, because remember, I told you earlier that the federal government owns all the water in the United States. Well, here's the deal. They gave that water to the individual states to manage. Texas is no exception to the rule. So Texas owns all the water that's surface in the state of Texas. And with that in mind, they have given it to primarily river authorities, and that's why the state is divided into something like the Brazos River Authority, the Colorado River Authority, Nueces, San Antonio, Guadalupe, so forth. And so all of these river authorities get to decide how they're going to use that water. They could use it for hydropower energy, they can sell it for water rights. One thing is for sure, water rights are worth money, and a lot of it, because they're valuable, especially the further west you get in the United States. Those water rights, they're no more. So in other words, there's no more to give. So as climate changes or it warms or more people are using water, there's a less availability of it. And so that's a key ingredient for why water rights is regulated the way it is. So basically, you can't just put a pump into a river and pump out water unless you have paid for that water through a water rights. Another program that TCEQ regulates in terms of water is public drinking water systems. PBS is what we call that. And we'll be looking more at that in one of our future lectures for this test unit. But public water systems, we need to make sure that they meet drinking water standards. And I would hope that you would want that, because your drinking water needs to be safe. Another program that TCEQ regulates is pretreatment. This is an example of pretreatment right here. So pretreatment is removing something before it goes into wastewater. So I want you to take a look at the concentration of this material right here. It's a waste product from a business. And we don't want that going down the sewer lines for a couple of reasons. It could be acidic. In this case, it's got a lot of blood in it from a slaughtering plant. And so you just don't want this stuff going down the sewer lines, because that publicly owned treatment works known as the sewer line is going to make it to a wastewater plant. This stuff comes into a wastewater plant, it can kill off the bacteria that are using that waste as their life support system, and thus a wastewater treatment plant ends up not treating the water they need to. So pretreatment's all about getting water clean enough to go to a wastewater plant to get clean to go to surface water. So pretreatment's a key element in one of the programs that TCEQ regulates. This is a wastewater plant, but what I want to point out is you can see a river adjacent to it. And so wastewater comes in, and it's actually going to come in, and then it's going to go through a series of filtration processes, and these big things are called clarifiers. But the real ugly stuff that has to be treated and turned into methane is actually going to be right here. So this is a complex system where wastewater treatment plants are regulated. They have permits. They must meet those permit guidelines because they're discharging into a river. So the downstream users are actually receiving treated wastewater before it goes through a drinking water system. In addition, the same type of thing can exist for rural homes that's on a much smaller scale. So a septic system is just a tiny little wastewater plant, and it's typically one that's underground, and there's several different types. We'll be looking at them in one of our lectures coming up for this testing unit, so hang tight for that. One of my favorite programs is stormwater. So stormwater is when it rains, when it hits the ground, it becomes regulated at a business. So if there's any type of pollutants that could be picked up, the law basically requires at the federal level that businesses reduce the potential for stormwater pollution, because stormwater never gets treated at a wastewater plant. So it goes directly into rivers, lakes, and streams untreated. And so there's no chance for it to improve its quality. So we regulate that at the state level as well. Let's look at the waste side of what TCEQ regulates. These are underground petroleum storage tanks. You might not have realized that most underground storage tanks that you use to get your gas out and when you go fill up your car can be located that close to the surface. But this is one of the very big programs that came about that we'll briefly talk about later in the semester as a consequence of basically 60 Minutes story that brought to light certain chemicals, specifically MTBE, that was used in gasoline to help remove lead for air quality purposes. Unfortunately, MTBE lingers in water environments. But more importantly are the BTEX chemicals known as benzene, toluene, ethylbenzene, and xylene that's put in gasoline. And one of those is a known carcinogen, human carcinogen, and that's benzene. Another good bonus question. So another program in the waste area, of course, is municipal solid waste, known as MSW. We'll have a whole lesson on that in the second course if you take that on landfills. A third program that's done in just about every regulatory entity that deals with a DEQ or TCEQ in our case, is illegal dumping. And this is an illegal dump, and you can see that the tires have caught fire. This is very devastating. So not only do you have volatile organic compounds and other types of potential SO2 and maybe even hazardous air pollutants and particulate matter, you've got problems with vectors and varmints, which are, insects and snakes and bugs and rodents and stuff like that. And we don't want that. That's an unclean environment, and tires are notorious for being dumped, but they're not the only type of illegal dump. Another thing that's regulated is industrial waste. This is an example of a railroad tie operation that has both industrial and hazardous waste. So I'll tell you kind of what's happening here. This particular entity is cooking railroad ties and actually putting a chemical that will preserve that wood. So it saturates this wood with that particular chemical, creosote to be exact, and then it's going to superheat it up and kind of make it adhere to that particular wood. So any of the materials that are non-hazardous from this business are regulated as industrial waste. Of course, any of the hazardous components would be regulated. For example, the drip waste from creosote would probably be listed as a hazardous waste. But this is more along the lines of what people think about hazardous waste. Hazardous waste, you'll learn in one of our lectures for this testing period, is very specific on how and what we call as hazardous. So don't be misled that all hazardous waste has to have a red bag. That's for red bag waste. That's called biohazard waste. In most cases, biohazard waste does not qualify as a hazardous waste. It's a medical waste. So we'll be looking more in detail at hazardous waste. Another mission that TCEQ is charged with is dealing with spills, and just about every Department of Environmental Quality will have to do this because EPA is the lead agency federal-wise that requires that all spills that meet what are called reportable quantities, definite test question there, RQs, and RQs are the limits for those are found in the Code of Federal Regulations. So anybody who carries contents that are hazardous have to know what the reportable quantities are. And if you hit those or exceed those, then you must report them immediately to the national hotline. So spills are important because if they're not cleaned up properly, for example, the contents of these yellow containers were in this private domestic vehicle, but they were actually business chemicals that were acutely hazardous. So if that's the case, then we got to have a cleanup. So regardless of who was at fault for the accident, we've got an environmental problem on our hands. Another aspect of what TCEQ regulates are national disasters. So both of these images came from after Hurricane Katrina and Rita. So they happened within a month of each other. And this is an underground petroleum storage tank. Should actually be underground with fuel in it. Instead, these things floated up to the surface. And if you can see the sheen right here, then that is the actual oil or petroleum products that now are a waste floating around that need to be cleaned up. That goes into the idea of understanding that there's an emergency response team that's highly qualified, and that's their main goal, to respond to any kind of emergency that might happen on a statewide basis. So they're actually called the strike team, and the strike team are made up of individuals that are have additional qualifications for this sort of aspect of the job. So when we look at TCEQ, another thing that comes up that's really important, and it's in every state, I promise you, are environmental complaints. So the legislature actually mandates that the state, in this case Texas, respond to every environmental complaint that's given by phone, by email, by video, by whatever means. And it can be anonymous or it can be from a known complainant. Regardless, this is the thing that most people don't know. The legislature for Texas basically made it, the Texas legislature mandated that the complainant's identity be concealed permanently. So in an open records request, that will get blacked out before it's given out. And I can remember having to do some of those open record requests when I worked for TCEQ, and that's the way it was. And even if someone was looking you in the eye in the field saying, hey, I know it's my neighbor, wasn't it my neighbor that called in the complaint? Couldn't say so because it's mandated by law, and that was grounds for immediate termination, and it's just not allowable. So it doesn't happen. It's just not that way. They can guess all they want to, and they may be right, and the complainant might voluntarily tell them. But some people want to remain anonymous or never have their name come up because their fear of retribution and retaliation. So an example of a complaint that might be received are from these chicken houses right here. Not saying these chicken houses specifically smell, but let's say you're a landowner and they are cleaning out their houses, and let's say there are 50,000 birds in each one of these long buildings. That's about right. Sometimes it can be more like 100,000. And when all of that chicken litter, that's what they call it, made up with their droppings, and imagine that for however long it took to grow them from little babies to broiler size, fixing to go to the chicken place to turn into what we eat as fast food or food that you might cook at home. So it kind of smells when they spread that stuff on the ground. Another example would be illegal dumps. So this was an example of an illegal dump in our region for TCEQ. I worked in Region 9, which is Waco, and it covered 20 counties. This is not in McLennan County by any means, but nevertheless, this particular illegal dump, this guy did it more than once, and I'll revisit this in just a little bit. Unauthorized discharges are another example. This particular guy was taking slaughter waste from a local slaughtering plant, and who is actually very reputable. The slaughtering plant is very famous group. I won't tell you who they are, but they have a really strong environmental program and also work with the people who take their rendering products, which is all the dead animal parts that aren't going to be used for meat. So they feed those as slop to these cute little guys right here. Unfortunately, this guy left rancid blood and grease and so forth and dead animal parts out, so it stunk. And the neighbors didn't like that, so they called in complaints. That didn't kill anybody at the time, but it sure was not very friendly or nice to live around, and he needed to clean it up. When an entity starts up or shuts down, for example, a power plant, they may have very dark emissions like this, and that may be allowable in their permit, but it's not on a regular basis. So when you see something like this, and this is called opacity, and that's like 100% opacity where you can't see through it, that is not acceptable. And then there are all the other complaints, like this one. Let's look at this guy, give you a little background. This guy complained about his neighbor sandblasting outside and that it was ruining his truck, and that these spots were sort of some of the paint had come off. And ironically, this is what the truck looked like when the investigator went out there. Hadn't been running for obviously like 25 years or more, right? So sometimes complaints are legit, sometimes they're not, but it doesn't matter. The state still has to respond to that, and it still has to be addressed. So every complaint is addressed. Let's look at a couple of other state agencies that are important to the environment in Texas. Texas Parks and Wildlife Department is basically the fish and wildlife equivalent from the federal level at the state level. And their mission is to manage and conserve natural and cultural resources of Texas. And they provide hunting, fishing, and outdoor recreation opportunities, permits, and so forth. You know that, hunting licenses. But they have a statewide enforcement program beyond hunting that deals with wildlife and natural resources. So they actually play a role in endangered species, and they help regulate endangered species. Another group that's really important for helping monitor and keep data for our water, surface water in the state of Texas, as well as managing water rights or river authorities. So Texas has multiple river authorities, and there's somewhere between 17, 20-ish of them, and each river authority is responsible for conducting an annual water quality report that's mandated by the Clean Water Act, and it's done through the Clean Rivers program known as CRP. That's a direct guaranteed test question. So they have to collect routine water samples. This is what I did when I worked for the Brazos River Authority. It was a great job. I was outdoors all the time collecting water samples and analyzing the data to make watershed decisions on how could we improve water quality. So each river authority is going to determine how to use their water that they have, and most of them sell water rights and or make hydroelectric power from water that's been dammed up in a reservoir. Another entity that plays a key role for infrastructure for wastewater and public water systems is the Texas Water Development Board. If you've not heard of these people, they have a lot of important stuff that might be applicable to you if you ever buy property, because they have basically all the water mapped out over Texas, including information on groundwater. So their mission is to provide leadership, planning, financial assistance, big part of what they do, information and education for the conservation and responsible development of Texas water. So they provide low interest loans to cities and political subdivisions that may need to, let's say, repaint a water tower for in a city, or maybe they need to replace some old pipes. They can apply for these low interest loans or grants, and they're very competitive. They also oversee what is federally mandated as the drought contingency plan for the state. And Texas had a really bad run-in back in the late 90s with droughts. And so basically the state made a decision that all areas of the state would be divided by letters, and these represented areas that had similar types of climate conditions and water needs. The biggest one obviously is G, and that's Brazos. That's where this college is located. And so that's a very large customer base, and basically all the stakeholders had to come to the table and determine what drought contingency rules look like for things like rationing of water and times of when we had drought. So that would affect you at home. Let's say you have a yard and you're on a rotation schedule because we're in a drought. That's an example of a drought contingency plan implementation. So let's look at environmental enforcement. So when we think about federal enforcement, it's not very clear cut, but it's a lot more expensive to violate at the federal level than it is at the state level. And EPA and other entities like them, like Fish and Wildlife Service and so forth, have very specific guidelines for how they execute and implement and carry out their enforcement. So enforcement usually involves two parts. Always involves fixing the problem. So whatever environmental problem happened must be fixed. Part two may or may not occur depending on the severity of the enforcement or the action that was violated, and that is a penalty. So it's possible you could have both. When you've got really serious infractions, they most always have both. And at the EPA level, I can tell you that they are not very merciful in terms of trying to help out violators, especially if the violators are not willing to show good faith effort in complying with the law. So they're hardcore, and they should be, because they have a regulatory mission at the federal level to protect these resources. For the state of Texas, it works a bit different. Environmental regulations are classified by letter. So I know in a grading system, people think of A as being good, B as pretty good, C as average. Let's reverse that. The higher the letter, the A being the highest letter, the worse the environmental problem has occurred. In other words, the violation is more significant, causing imminent threats to human health and or the environment. So a category A violation basically means that you're going to have immediate enforcement because it's an imminent threat. Category B's, we'll look at each of these in a minute, is something that's not an imminent threat that needs to be cleaned up. And C typically involves some type of a record-keeping violation. I will tell you that enforcement done this way at the state level is very long because it's administrative. If you've not dealt with administrative, basically it is it's not even civil, it's not criminal, it's administrative. So there's a separate court set of hearings called the State Office of Administrative Hearings, known as SOA. And they hear these cases and make judgments. So it's a very long, drawn out process. There is a special environmental crimes unit that does do criminal cases, but there's only a handful of investigators for the entire state that do that. So they would be using special law, Texas Health and Safety Code, Texas Water Code, and they would be referring to statutes as opposed to administrative law. So most investigators for TCEQ and similar state agencies all are non-police officers, so they must have jurisdiction to be able to enforce the law. So they are given that through an administrative set of rules. This would be an example of a Category A violation. First of all, look at the red. These are blood tapeworms here, and this is exactly what it looks like. It's sewage. So this kind of discharge could lead to a fish kill, and a fish kill would be a case in point for an imminent threat. You had dead animals. So this would be a Category A violation. So that requires immediate enforcement, and when that happens, they'll go through enforcement. The entity that caused it, they will have to clean up the problem and may also have a fine. If you have a Category B violation, this would be a good example where you get some kind of operation outdoors. This is sandblasting or some kind of a operation creating emissions. And there's not an immediate imminent impact, but long-term there could be issues to the environment and or to human health. So most of the time this includes unauthorized discharges unless those discharges were imminent threat, an unauthorized air emission leaving the facility, which would be like this right here, failure to make a waste determination, which you'll learn about in one of our upcoming lectures for this test period, and illegal dumping, unauthorized dumping. A Category C violation is typically a record-keeping violation. Sometimes this could actually be a bad problem, and it could actually end up being an A violation if there was an intentional change of, for example, filling out this hazardous waste label and calling it a different waste so you can bypass expenses, and it's actually something very ugly that could seep through a landfill liner and create contamination and kill people. But most of the time it's just little bitty record-keeping things like one of these waste labels here, or maybe it's just a signature's in the wrong place, or they don't have the right paper on site. So it's usually mashed potatoes, small stuff. But I want to tell you, there's sometimes Category C violations can be extremely dangerous. So nevertheless, they need to get corrected long term, because paperwork violations, I have actually seen a case and been involved with a case that did turn out to be an imminent threat. So we want people following the rules because there's a reason for each rule. It's not to be unnecessary and overwhelming. There's an intention for proper paperwork. And it makes sense as we go through the environmental regulations after this lecture. So what is compliance history? Texas basically put into law something back around 2000-ish or so, something similar to what your credit history would be, but they did it for the environment. So basically entities that had repetitive environmental problems, we wanted to put some type of record in place that could show that they were poor environmental actors, and subsequently those that were great actors, give them an incentive and something to hold on to. If you want to call it bragging rights, there it is too, but it's good PR, meaning public relations. So in Title 30 of the Texas Administrative Code, Chapter 60, which is a test question by the way, Chapter 60 deals with compliance history. So what all does it cover? I'm not going to test you necessarily on what all it covers, but this is the list right here. Water quality laws in Chapter 26, subsurface area drip dispersal systems in Chapter 32, injection wells in Chapter 27, Texas Solid Waste Disposal Act in Chapter 361, Texas Clean Air Act, and Texas Radiation Control Act. So basically, if you've screwed up in any of these areas, it's going to show up on your compliance history report. The report actually starts each September and goes through an entire fiscal year, which the fiscal year goes from September 1 to August 31st. So bottom line is they're looking at the last 5 years of history. So a year drops off. So let's say 5 years ago, a business had a horrible thing happen and an imminent threat. They ended up with a Category A violation, and you'll learn in a minute they had to get some kind of an order put in place which required them to go to enforcement. So on the 6th year, that's going to drop off the radar screen. So how does the rating work? I put the rating on directly from the TCEQ website here. If you have a rating greater than 55.00, and the .00 is important because 1/100th of a difference keeps you out of the satisfactory. So basically, if you're greater than 55.00, which would be 55.01, then you are unsatisfactory. But notice if you're at 55.00, you're satisfactory. Okay, so the folks that are 0.10 to 55.00 are satisfactory, and everybody that's below 0.10 are high or excellent. And you want to be in satisfactory or high, preferably high, because if you're in the unsatisfactory category, it's not a good thing for a lot of reasons, and I'll be getting into those as we talk about it. So I want you to think about the rating like a golf game. The higher the strokes you have, in this case, the higher the number of environmental bad things you've done, the worse off you are, the worse player you are. So if you have a score of 100 on your golf game, I wouldn't say you're going to be going out on the PGA Tour anytime soon, right? So the same kind of thing applies here when we're looking at the classification system. Another thing to consider about compliance history in this 5-year cycle is that businesses sometimes, and public entities like cities, may have a poor compliance history rating for one thing and not another. For example, the city may have one for their landfill, but their water system may be excellent. And so the PR elements like this, I had a lady that used to find us when I worked for the Brazos River Authority in a town in Texas, and there's a creek that's out there that has high salinity. It's unusual, but it's a groundwater issue that causes it, a geology problem. And this woman was out to get this tortilla factory. And bottom line was she hung up flyers all over town, went to public meetings, started drawing up customers, and made a real big fuss and found out about compliance history. And they actually had a satisfactory compliance history, but they had had some bad things happen. And so they were getting closer to that 55 score. And this lady would bug me every year, even when I left the BRA and moved to TCEQ. She found me my first day there. Even when I left and came to the college where I am now, she still calls me occasionally. It's been a few years now, but she was really elderly at that time. And I just thought that, wow, this lady made a ginormous difference in terms of PR and almost put the tortilla factory out of business. It was not the tortilla factory that was causing the environmental problems that she had concerns with. So sometimes the PR element can be a big deal, and people need to think about that when they're kind of going up against companies. Is this really the cause of the problem? Because if it is, then fight your battle. But sometimes it may not be what it seems, and that was the case in her particular town. So let's look at our science servings, our daily dose of science, and you've got to have that. I know that is so gross, but this is what the inside of sewer pipes look like when they're clogged up with grease. So we call fats, oils, and grease, it's a regulatory term, referred to as FOG, F-O-G. You need to know that for your tests. So fog is detected by local governments like cities by doing a smoke test and putting through some type of a pipe, and if a certain amount of smoke doesn't come out, then they'll go ahead and do the second, more expensive task, which is to put a camera in and photograph the inside of a pipe and figure out where the source of the grease is coming from. So let's say, FYI, we have a commercial eating establishment that does a lot of frying, and they're dumping their oils and fats and grease down the drain. This is exactly what could happen. In addition, let's say a homeowner does that over a long period of time. If you clog up the city side of the pipe, guess whose problem it is? Yours. And they'll bill you for all of this, not just for the cleanup, but they'll bill you for the expensive part of putting the camera in, the smoke test. And by the way, if it does back up, what will end up happening is the sewage is going to back up into whatever is being blocked. So it goes back into the businesses of the restaurant, and it can go into people's homes. It's very bad thing. So there are ways to properly dispose of your bog, and make sure that you are not washing your grease down the drain. Smoking vehicles is one of my most passionate topics. I just despise smoking vehicles. TCEQ administers the smoking vehicle program. There's one at the federal level, and just about every state has one. Interesting thing is, though, it's not an enforcement program per se at the state level. It looks like one because if you get a complaint on your car for it smoking for more than 10 consecutive seconds, test question, more than 10 consecutive seconds, and it doesn't have, it can be any kind of car. It doesn't matter whether it's an 18-wheeler diesel or it's just a little sports car that runs on unleaded gas. If it's smoking for more than 10 consecutive seconds, then it qualifies as a smoking vehicle. The problem is that we can't figure out the owners of these outside of Texas. So if a smoking vehicle has Utah plates on it, or Mississippi plates, or Arkansas plates, or California plates, we're not going to be able to run it in Texas. So we're not going to send them a letter. But if they do have Texas plates and we get a complaint through the hotline, which is 1-800-453-SMOG, then we will send them a letter. The state will send them this little nice letter first that says, hey, you were spotted in your vehicle with smoking. Here's the problems with that. Here's the citation of having clean air. Do your part for clean air in Texas and fix it. You'd be surprised that like 90% of people fix it after the first letter. So the remaining 10%, let's say they get a second letter, it's not so friendly the next time. The third letter, if they're in an area that's non-attainment, like Houston, Dallas, Fort Worth, El Paso, San Antonio, they'll have a local air program because they're non-attainment for air quality, because they're busting the federal ambient air quality standards. We'll send them that information, and then they can go to enforcement because there'll be some kind of local ordinance prohibiting smoking vehicles. Just about every town has that. This is a smoking vehicle I saw personally. It was one that really needed some repair work, and I just wanted to show you what one looks like. So this car was smoking we followed it for 15 minutes because we were in our neighborhood and trying to get home, and it was all the way from the grocery store to the house. And the pollution was incredible. So this is what a smoking vehicle looks like. I hope you don't have one. If you do, get it fixed. Another thing that's an issue is outdoor burning, and outdoor burning is illegal in the state of Texas, period. It's illegal, but there are exceptions to the rule. So before you went, oh, what about this? Let me tell you what the exceptions are and what they're not. Basically, you can't burn these things ever. Electrical, insulation, plastics, heavy oils, explosives, like really, but you'd be surprised what people put in fire, munitions and fireworks and stuff like that. Chemical waste and tires. And like here's a whole tire thing being put up, and typically people don't burn tires except at night, because they don't want anybody to see the black plume. You can actually see them from satellite orbit, and it makes such a dark emission. Bottom line is, if you meet an exception, and there's many exceptions to the rule, including ceremonial fires like bonfires, campfires, there is prescribed burns, there is burning of your trash if you're out in the county that doesn't have, you're not within the city limits. Bottom line is, you can never burn if you cause a nuisance, nor can you burn if there's a county burn ban in effect. What that means is, if the county that you live in has a burn ban, you cannot burn even if it's rained 10 inches the night before until they lift it. It's all done through a procedure of public notice, so it doesn't just get lifted overnight. So make sure and check the websites with your county, or better yet, the fire folks, and make sure that your county does not have a burn ban in place before you do any burns that are considered legal. But remember, they're not legal if they ever cause a nuisance. Guaranteed test question. Can you burn outside trash? And the answer is yes, if you're outside the city limits. The burn rules prohibit burning from inside the city limits. And by the way, cities cannot issue burn permits. that is not in, that's less stringent than the state. So you must burn within your burn barrel in the same day, and you got to stay with your burn barrel, and you can't have any prohibited items, and you can't cause a nuisance. Burn barrels can get out of hand and can burn property, and I'm a case in point where somebody had a burn barrel out in the country when I lived out near a small town in Texas, and it burned down hundreds of acres and made it to our front yard before it got put out. And so luckily we didn't lose a house, but other people did. Another thing I'd like to share with you about enforcement is Superfund. You'll learn more about Superfund in our Waste and RECRA lecture coming up for this test period, but this program is designed to help clean up some of the nation's most contaminated sites. And the goal of the Superfund program is to make visible and lasting differences in communities, and you'll learn about Love Canal when we get to waste, so people can live and work in healthy, safe environments that are not contaminated by the land. So know that Superfund's out there. You should do a Google search and see what Superfund sites are in your backyard, and you might be surprised. So as I leave you today, we always leave with this real motivating thing, right? So here's our consistency. If it's only a virtue if you're not a screw up. I hope that you are just the opposite, that you're on target, hitting the bullseye every time. And when it comes to environmental agencies, we want them to do the same thing. We don't want them to miss the mark. We want them to stay on cue. I'll be looking forward to seeing you in our next lecture. Bye.